much for coming tonight. We've got a great crowd. As you can see, we are going to be, the value added forum tonight is going to be about JavaScript and jQuery, and it's going to be sponsored by AIS tonight. This is the kickoff one, and so we hope that you enjoy your experience here and that you'll be able to learn and grow from having been at this value added forum. This is Matt Swensen. He is pretty much one of the most amazing guys that I know. He had the opportunity to intern at Lucidchart over the summer, and he is a JavaScript and jQuery guru. So I'm going to hand the time over to him. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Morgan. All right. Thanks for coming tonight, guys. That was really nice of Morgan to say that. I don't know if I'm a guru, but hopefully we can talk together tonight about JavaScript and get excited about it and learn a little bit. So, like he said, my name is Matt Swensen. I interned at Lucidchart, like he said, this last summer, and did a lot of JavaScript while I was there. I was on the client team, so we did front-end web development technologies, JavaScript, CSS, a lot of HTML, and I enjoyed it so much that I continue to work with them now and will next summer, and then after I graduate as well. So it's pretty exciting. I'm a first-year MISM student, by the way. So let's dive right in. This is what we're going to do tonight. We're going to breeze through the basics of JavaScript because I am confident that you guys will pick it up really quick. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we're going to actually do some interactive JavaScripting together and kind of talk about some of the fundamentals and some of the more advanced concepts of JavaScript. And then we're going to dive into jQuery for just a couple of minutes before we start building our very own fully functional jQuery application together. And that'll be it. So it's going to be fun. Okay, so just by way of a background for JavaScript. JavaScript is an interpreted language, usually. I say that because there are various platforms and runtime environments for JavaScript. You can run JavaScript on the server, but what we're going to talk about mostly tonight is JavaScript in the browser, which is by far the most common use case for JavaScript. Okay. Superheroes, the ultimate trio. We've got JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And I just want to be clear about what each of those are and what they do in the context of a web page as you view it. Louder? Okay. Thanks. I'll try and be louder. That's why I brought this. Okay, so HTML defines the structure of your web page, your document. When you write HTML, you're essentially telling the computer, this snippet of text is a paragraph or a heading, and so this is more important than this. But it doesn't really have anything to do with interactivity or the way the page looks as you view it in your browser. CSS is what controls the style for the web page, so it interacts with HTML in that it controls how it looks on the page, right? But both of those together without JavaScript would just be kind of a boring, static web page. We need JavaScript to add interactivity for the user. So that's kind of how those three things work together. Really briefly, this is really boring stuff, so we won't spend a lot of time on it, but JavaScript was originally developed by a guy named Brendan Eich. I think that's how you say his name. And it was first released with Netscape Navigator 2 all the way back in 1995. And then it kind of became an industry standard just a few years after that. It's come a long way in 18 years, and there's some really exciting things that we're going to talk about today about JavaScript. So, how many of you are familiar with GitHub, the website? I'd say about half. It's a popular website that allows you to host your code repositories, and it has a special emphasis on open source software. And so I just found this statistic online from this blog you see at the bottom. Of all the repositories uploaded to GitHub this year, JavaScript has a pretty big lead over all the other languages. So it's pretty popular, you guys. It's definitely growing, and it's a fun place to be. Okay, let's get into the good stuff. So for those of you who've never written a line of JavaScript before in your life, it's got syntax similar to C and the other family of C-like languages like Java. I'm assuming most of you have some experience with Java, right? IC students. So a lot of this stuff is going to seem real familiar. We've got our if statement, and the code that is executed if the if statement evaluates to true is surrounded in curly braces, just like Java. We've got an object here called foo, which has an attribute called bar. So you use dot notation just like Java to get into it. Or in this case, we're assigning a string value to that attribute. And you can see on the third line, we've got the new keyword, just like in Java. When you have a new object, use the new keyword to initialize it. And that var keyword is how we initialize new variables. But unlike Java, JavaScript is weakly typed, so we don't have to define what type the variable is. We don't have to say string whatever equals string. It's kind of, in my opinion, Java is always verbose in that way, and JavaScript kind of does away with a lot of that. So it's dynamic and it's very weakly typed. This isn't super important, but it's definitely worth mentioning. JavaScript employs function scoping rather than block scoping. So what that means is, in many other languages, if you open up a new block, like with an if statement or a for loop or a while loop, any variables that you declare inside that block are local to that block. But JavaScript is not like that. It's only like that with functions. So as you can see here, we've got a new function that we're defining on the first line. And then the next one, we define a new variable called myVar. And then we go into, admittedly, a superfluous if statement, if true. So we're inside that block. And if we try and say myVar again and redefine it, it's actually going to overwrite that first one rather than simply mask it for the duration of the block. So if we go back out of the block and we try and print out the value of that myVar, it's going to be goodbye instead of hello world. Something to be aware of. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into actually coding stuff. And JavaScript doesn't have classical inheritance like Java. So there are no such things as classes in JavaScript, which would be like a blueprint of your object, right? There are only objects. So when you inherit from when you instantiate a new object, it inherits from another object rather than being created from a class. And they call it prototypes because let's say you're building a race car, and you're trying to, engineer this new race car that's going to be faster than all the other ones. The first thing you do is you build a prototype, right? And it doesn't have everything that your final race car is going to have, but it's the basic thing, and it works, and it's not just a blueprint, but it's an actual object. So then your boss says, yeah, that's a great race car, and you go and you build the real thing. And it's got everything that the prototype has, but a little bit more. JavaScript objects are exactly like that. Okay. Is Dr. Albrecht here today? No, he's not. Okay. Dr. Albrecht doesn't really like JavaScript very much. And so he's got a lot of arguments against some of the bad parts of JavaScript, which admittedly there are some. But we're going to talk about the good parts and how you can avoid the bad parts. And it really is a great language if you focus on the good parts. Okay. For example, this is an object in JavaScript. You'll see that we're creating an object simply with these curly braces right here. And we define members or attributes of the object, and with a colon and their value. You can see that this is a very concise way to define an object. We've got a couple of string attributes here, and we've got one that's a method, which returns a concatenation of first name and last name, right? This.first name with a space, this.last name. Got another string one here. We've got another attribute that's a Boolean. And in here we've got an array. And we'll talk about arrays on the next slide, but you can see we've got an array of strings. So in just these few lines, we've defined an object in a very concise way. So this notation is called literal notation for objects. Pretty handy stuff. If you can imagine what this would look like in Java, we'd have to say, string first name equals Han, and we'd have a whole lot more code to accomplish the same thing. What's cool about other things in JavaScript is that arrays have this similar literal syntax, and so do regular expressions. So for arrays, all you have to do to create an array is use the square brackets, and you can put any data type in there that you want. You don't have to have, they don't all have to be the same thing. You can have strings, numbers, booleans, whatever you want. Pretty slick, right? Regular expressions. This is probably one of my favorite of the rich literal syntax that JavaScript gives you. And all you have to do to create a regular expression is you just put the regular expression between two, what are those, forward slashes? I always get those mixed up. Forward slashes, right? And there you go. You have a new regular expression object, just like that. You don't have to create a pattern and a matcher and all kinds of other stuff like you do in Java. You guys ready to go interactive here and code? Okay, so functions, in my opinion, are the very best part of JavaScript. Functions are what they call first-class objects. So you can take a function and assign it to a variable, and you can do all kinds of things with it. We're gonna go over it together. So for those of you who brought your computers, which if you didn't, that's kind of weird because this is the nicest thing, but go to jsfiddle.net/MJ Swensen, and I'll read it to you so you can type it in. /K, lowercase g, lowercase k, capital P, capital G. And that will give us something that looks like this, hopefully. You guys seeing this? If you want to. Obviously, you don't have to. But we've got some exercises here that we're going to go through together.
So 404 error.
404? That's annoying.
You go back to the link.
Yeah, you bet. Did I type it out wrong?
Oh, I know. There's Swensen with an O instead of an E.
Ah, yep, that'll do it. Swensen with an E in at the end. Don't worry, you're not the first person to spell it wrong. Happens all the time. Are we ready? You guys got that in? I'm going to take that as a yes, because nobody said no. Okay. For those of you who are new to functional programming, this is probably going to be a stretch of the brain, but it's a good stretch, and once you do it, you're never going to go back, because it's awesome. This first exercise demonstrates how functions can be passed to other functions as parameters. Let's make that a little bigger. I'm just going to read this to you. Below is a function that takes a function as its third parameter. Because of this, it is considered a higher order function. It does some calculations and then invokes the function that was passed to it, giving said function the results of the calculations as parameters. Okay, that's a mouthful. Let's take a look at it. We've got this function here that we've called divide. It takes three parameters, a, b, and one called callback. And then what we do is we create a couple of variables. This one, quotient, we do math.floor, which is math is the JavaScript math library, as you might have guessed. .floor will take a number and round it down. So we're going to take a divided by b and round it down, and assign that to quotient, or quote for short. We've got our second variable called rem for remainder, and we do a mod b, which takes a divided by b, but it throws everything away except for the remainder. Does that make sense so far? Nods? Cool. Then we're going to take our third parameter, which we called callback, and we're going to invoke it, passing our calculations into it. Okay? So our task, our exercise, is to invoke divide, and we're going to give it two integers of our choice, and then we're going to give it a function that it's going to call as the third parameter. Okay? I'm going to give you guys like 10 seconds to get a start, and if you're totally lost, we're going to do it together. Okay, so if you're on a roll, just keep going, but if you're not, you can follow along. So we're going to invoke divide. So, as you might remember from in most other languages, you just type the name of the function, open up the parentheses, and we're going to pass two integers and a function. So let's do something cool like that as our first parameter, and another one, and then here, let's go ahead, and while we're at it, we're just going to close the parentheses there and put our semicolon so we don't forget later. And now we're going to pass in what's called an anonymous function as a third parameter to this function. So how you do that is you go function, parentheses, and then the block for the function. And we're going to go back and fill this in now. So we can see now as we're kind of getting ready to write our function, we look up here, we know that this callback is going to be called with two parameters. So we need to put two parameters in here. So let's call it Q and the other one R. Okay. Let's go into our function body now. And we can do whatever we want now with these calculations that have been made. So let's, I included here at the bottom just a helper function here that's called print that will allow us to see stuff over here in this result box on the right. So let's just use that. We're going to go print. We'll do a string. The quotient, I don't know if I spelled that right, is Q. Print, let's do another one, with remainder R. Let's try and run it and see what happens now. Hopefully we did it right. Okay. So you see on the right, the quotient is 67 with remainder 8. So 78 goes into 5,234 67 times with the remainder of 8. I know that's, if you've never done it before, that's a new concept. Do we have any questions about that? First class functions? Yeah. Yeah, sure. So he wants me to zoom in. Let's figure out how to do that. Something like this?
Yeah, that would be perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I wonder if I can make this one smaller. Nope. Actually,
Try Control Shift up.
there we go. Control Shift up. Thanks. Make sure I'm looking at the right spot. Any questions before we move on to the next one? Okay. You ready for some more mind-blowing? Functions can be return values from other functions as well. This is incredibly powerful, you guys. Okay, just as functions can be passed as parameters, they can be returned from other functions. So our task is to write a function called getRandomGenerator, and it takes two parameters, that returns a function that will return a random number between the two numbers A and B. I didn't write that very well, but that's what we're trying to do. We're going to write a function that returns a function, and the function that we return is going to return a random number between the two numbers that we gave the original function. It sounds like a mouthful, but once we write it out, it'll make sense. So let me give you 10 more seconds to give it a shot, and then we'll do it together. Okay, if you're going, then go for it. If not, follow along. So let's create our function. Get random generator A and B. Oops. Should probably do this. Function Okay. So we need to return a function. And we can do that with the same anonymous function syntax that we did to pass a function as a parameter. So let's do it. Return function. Just set that up for us. Okay. So let's jump into the body of the function that we're returning and do some calculations. So our goal is to return a random number between A and B. So that algorithm is going to look something like this. Math.floor again, we're going to round down. Oh, let's put return before I forget. Return. Put our semicolon there so we don't forget. Math.floor, and we're going to do math.random. This, as you would expect, gives us a random number, and it's between 0 and 1. So let's multiply that by the maximum minus the minimum plus 1, and then we're going to add to that the minimum. Don't worry too much about how that's going to work. I mean, I'm sure you guys can figure it out, but that's not the purpose of this, is to show how we can return a function from a function. Okay. So now that we've got that written, we can uncomment these lines. And hopefully we can reason just a little bit before we try it about how this is going to work. So we've got a new variable, which we're going to call getRandom between 1 and 10. And we call getRandomGenerator. We pass in 1 and 10, and that returns a function that, when invoked, will return a number between 1 and 10. And so we're just going to go print getRandom between 1 and 10. We're going to call it, and then that will show a number on the right side. Let's try it, and hopefully I didn't screw it up. There it is on the right. Looks like we got 1. Oh, that's annoying. Let's try it again. Got 8 this time. So you can see it's returning a random number between 1 and 10. With not a very even distribution at this point. There we go. Any questions about that? John.
So in the middle, in the inner function that you're returning, why don't you have to pass in A and B?
So that is a great question, and that perfectly illustrates the principle of closure. So what closure is that when you define a function, it has access to all the variables that are in scope at the time that it's defined, not necessarily at the time that it's called. So you can see here, we're returning a function, and just like Sean said, we don't have any parameters going in, but we're using B and A because they're in scope, because they're inside this other function. That principle is called closure. Does that make sense? Yeah, Morgan.
Can you repeat the question that was asked?
Oh, thanks. So the question was, why do we not have to pass A and B as parameters to this function? And, obviously there is a way that we could write a function that would do that, but this one is just different. We're just demonstrating how you can generate a function from a function. Cool. Any other questions? Is that making sense at all? Are we totally lost? Are we doing good? I see some nods. Cool. We're doing good. Okay. Let's move on to the next one. This is our last one. Okay. So in JavaScript, functions are objects. And so just like objects in other languages have methods, functions also have methods, which is kind of weird to wrap your head around at first because it's a function and you wouldn't think that a function would have methods, but it does. And it has a few, but two of the most handy ones are called call and apply. And we're going to see how this works. So what call and apply both allow you to do is choose the context of the function when it gets invoked. And by that I mean, what does this refer to when it's inside the function? The keyword this. So we've got this simple function here called log me. And all it does is it's going to print over to this right box over here this.constructor.name and this. So this is going to be, well, that's kind of weird. The keyword this is going to refer to different things depending on where and how this function gets called. So when we use call and apply, it gives us increased flexibility and control over what this refers to. Okay, so let's take a look at it. Actually, yeah, just go ahead. Give you just a couple minutes to try and figure it out, and then we'll do it together. I guess I should say what you're supposed to do first, right? What you're going to do is invoke logme using call, and try a few different things to change the context. So the first parameter that goes into call is what you want the context to be, or what you want this to refer to. Okay, let's do it together. So let's just keep this one. So when we say logme.call and we pass in the string hello world, what we're telling logme is that this refers to the string hello world. So let's just see what happens when we try a couple different things. So we'll do logme.call 5. We'll use an integer. Let's try logme.call. Let's do a literal array of strings. And finally, let's do logme.call, and we'll give it a regex literal that we saw in the previous slides. So now if we hit run, I should have explained, sorry, that this.constructor.name is just a way to see what type of object this is. Okay? So let's hit run. So we can see that the first time we call it, logme.call hello world, this is a string and its value is hello world. And then we call it with a number, this is a number. And we call it with an array, this is an array and a regex. This is a pretty non-useful example, but it's quite powerful that you have control over what this means in a function. Any questions? Okay.
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
Mine originally was all undefined. It wouldn't tell me much.
Oh, really?
Yeah. From everything I see.
Are you doing logme.call?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll have to take a look at it maybe after and see what's going on there. That's kind of weird. Okay. Any other questions? Nope. We're moving on. Yes, I want to leave this page. Okay. Oh, so you can see here we've got links. This presentation is actually built in HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And it's available on my website, and it's also available on GitHub. It's open source, so if you ever wanted to come back, you could just open this up and click on the links and get back to those exercises anytime you wanted. Or you could look at the source code for it. And I think this video will be on AIS too, so. Okay, I know that was really fast, and we just barely scratched the surface on just a few little things. So here's some additional JavaScript resources you guys can check out. This book, The Good Parts, is awesome. It's like 100 pages, and it talks about all the awesome things about JavaScript and how to avoid some of the bad things. This book, JavaScript Enlightenment, is great. I'd say it's a great first book about JavaScript if you're new to it, and it's free. At least the pre-O'Reilly editions are free, so the author, when he was getting feedback about it, he posted it, and then O'Reilly came in, which is the publisher, sorry, And when they publish it, obviously it's not free, but you can, the free version is great. So this is a link to it. You can go to it if you want. And JavaScript Design Patterns. This is a great book for JavaScript, but also for any language. It just talks about various design patterns and how to structure your code. So, and it's also free. So check those out. Okay, before we go on to jQuery, I just want to show you guys some of the really cool things that people are doing with JavaScript these days. It's a lot different than Netscape Navigator 2 back in '95. So here is a JavaScript library called D3. D3 meaning data-driven documents. And this guy has written a library that allows you to manipulate vector graphics, SVG to be more specific, scalable vector graphics, with JavaScript to create really interactive representations of complex data. This could be really useful if you're ever building like a dashboard for your company that needed to visualize data in a way that graphs and 2 dimensions just don't cut it. Let's see if we can find a cool one. See more examples. I wish Justin was here because he knows a lot about this library. I haven't used it, but there's some pretty cool stuff. So this doesn't have any data in it, but it's really cool. So we'll just look at this one. Move your mouse around, these little balls kind of react to it. And this is all done with JavaScript, so pretty neat. This one blows my mind. It's called 3.js, and it's a 3D engine for JavaScript. So people have built video games with JavaScript. I was playing this one for like 20 minutes. I was like, wow, this is awesome. Got totally sidetracked. There's a bunch of them on here. We won't look at any of them, but it's pretty amazing stuff. You may have heard already of Node.js. It's a popular framework for server-side JavaScript. So it doesn't run in the browser, but it's instead of having like Java servlets or whatever, you would use Node, and so you'd have JavaScript be on your server on your backend, which is pretty cool, especially if you have a JavaScript on your front end, on your web page that's communicating with your server. Then you've got everything in the same language, and they can communicate with JSON and all kinds of cool stuff. So Node's pretty cool. It's really fast in that it's got an asynchronous model, and it's cool. So this I thought was interesting. It's an article about a new JavaScript. I don't know if it's a library or what, but it's called asm.js, and it's a subset of JavaScript that I think the guys at Firefox, Mozilla, have optimized, and it's as fast, almost as fast as a program that if it were written in C or C++, which is, you're never going to find that in your browser JavaScript or in a language like Java or Ruby or PHP. They're never going to be as fast as like C or C++. And so the fact that they've got a JavaScript library now that you can write programs and they go that fast is pretty amazing. In fact, how many of you are video gamers? A couple? You ever played Unreal Tournament? These guys, Unreal Tournament is written in either C or C++, and they ported it over to JavaScript, and it ran just fine, which is mind-boggling to me. It's a 3D first-person shooter. Okay, this one might be more interesting to you guys. This is one of many frameworks that allows you to write an application with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And obviously it works on the web in your browser, and then you can also put it on an iPhone or an Android phone and have your app just like that. You don't have to write any Java code or any Objective-C for iOS. You write your app once, and it goes to all the platforms. Pretty cool stuff. Really cool stuff. This one I think just kind of pulls the application up in like a web view, or like a Safari window or whatever if you're on iOS. But there are other ones that will actually take your JavaScript code and compile it into Objective-C or Java. So if you get good at JavaScript, you can write for any platform now, which is pretty cool. Okay, let's move on to jQuery. So people who are new to jQuery often get confused about what jQuery is and how it relates to JavaScript, so I thought we could just talk briefly about that. jQuery is a JavaScript library, so and it does a very specific set of things that are pretty common to web developers, like manipulating the HTML document, handling events, so when someone clicks on something, you catch that event and you do something. Animation, and of course you've probably heard of AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript in XML, which is when your JavaScript can make a request to the server without the page being reloaded. So jQuery does all that stuff really, really well. That being said, you don't always need to turn to jQuery. Sometimes regular JavaScript is more appropriate. So just use discretion there, I guess. All right. So how does jQuery work? jQuery utilizes what is called the facade design pattern, which means that everything that you do when you're using jQuery is done through a single function, and that function is called the $, as you can see here on the screen. So typically what you'll do with jQuery is you'll invoke this $sign function and you'll give it a string, and the string is a CSS selector that matches elements on your page. So in this first example, if we call this function will return all of the elements on my page that have the HTML elements that have an attribute, class attribute of accordion. And then what you do at that point is you call methods on that returned jQuery object and manipulate those elements on your page as you want. So this example, we're getting all of the elements on the page with the class accordion, and we're doing a little animation that slides them down, and we want it to do that animation in 300 milliseconds or 0.3 seconds. Pretty cool stuff. It's really, really easy. Yo, sorry, yeah, question.
So my question is, if you were to try to accomplish the same thing in JavaScript, how much code would it take to do that?
It would take probably a dozen.
Dozen lines?
Yeah, just to do that simple thing right there. Yeah. And what's really cool about jQuery, you guys, is that it's not so much of a problem now, but even a few years ago, you could write a line of JavaScript and it would execute differently in different browsers. It would have different behavior, which is super annoying. So the guys at jQuery, one of the main reasons why they invented it is they wanted developers to be able to write JavaScript using jQuery and not have to worry about cross-browser stuff, making it work in every browser. So that's a huge advantage. Yeah?
Just a recap of what you said. So this will take all class accordion objects and then just make them all do that animation slide down.
Exactly, yep. And it'll just do it right then.
You just be writing it not as part of the HTML, but separate.
So the question is, where would we write this? And you could write it in a script tag on your HTML, or you could put it in its own file and tell the HTML to load up that JavaScript file. Either way. Any other questions? Okay. So I just thought we'd briefly go over another common and very useful use case of jQuery is to make asynchronous requests to the server. So this is just one way to do it. There's lots of ways to use jQuery to do asynchronous requests. This is the way that I've always done it, so that's why I wrote it this way. So all you do is you've got your jQuery object here, or function object, whatever you want to call it, and we call this AJAX method. And you'll see here we're actually passing in as the one and only parameter to this method is an object. So we got the curly brace here. That make sense? So in that object we are passing all the options that we want jQuery to do with our asynchronous request. So we're telling our JavaScript to make a request to /user/create. We're making a post request because we're going to create a new user in our system. This is a fictional system, obviously. And the data that we're sending to the server, first name Admiral, last name Akbar, bio. It's a trap. Any Star Wars people in here? And then we say when the request comes back successful, do this. We're just going to log to our console that the user was created successfully, and then the status code of the server, which would probably be 201 or 200 or something. And then if it doesn't work, we want to do this error callback, and we say console.log, there was a problem creating the user, and this is what the server said went wrong. So there you have it. It's an asynchronous request from your JavaScript without the page reloading to the server and manipulating the data on the server. Any questions about that? Okay. This is the fun part. We're going to build our own app together now. For those of you who were in the junior core last year, section 1, this will be the same one we did last year. I apologize, but hopefully it's been long enough to where you forgot how to do it. So, jsfiddle.net/mjswensen/ lowercase b, capital R, lowercase s, lowercase b, lowercase r. Anybody need another second? Okay, we're going. Okay, I might have to zoom out a little bit just so we can kind of see what's going on. And then we'll zoom back in when we get back to coding. So here we've got this, we've got some HTML up here, and we've got some CSS to control the style. You don't really need to worry about any of that right now. And so you can see here, this is the result. We've got this to-do list, but it doesn't really do anything yet. That's where the JavaScript comes in. So what we're going to do together is we're going to make this thing work. So you can see we type in and click add, doesn't do anything yet. Okay. So you'll see on the left side here that we are loading jQuery. So we have access to jQuery when we write our JavaScript. Let's hide that sidebar so we... Oh, what was it? Control Shift up. There we go. But just once. Okay. Wow, that's not wanting to resize for me. That's no fun. Okay. Well, we'll just have to deal with that. So the first thing we want our application to do is that when you click on this checkbox, actually let me just show you the final version here so we have an idea of what we're shooting for. So here's our finished app. Ready? When we click the checkbox, we get a nice strike through in the text and it kind of grays out so it gets out of our way. We can undo it if we want. We can add new ones. And we can check those ones off if we want. And then once our list gets kind of bogged down with all these things we've already done, we can hit purge completed and it'll take them out. And we can just keep going from there. Okay, so that's what we're shooting for. I think you guys will be surprised with how easy it is with jQuery to accomplish this. Okay. So the first thing we'll do together is let's make it so that when you click on the checkbox, it does that strike through text and makes it gray, so it kind of gets out of your way. So if we pull this down a little bit and we look up at the structure of the HTML, we've got this unordered list that has a class to-do list that's storing all of our list items that are for our to-do list. Okay. So what we want to do is when the input checkbox input gets clicked, we want to add a CSS class to this list item so that it has a different appearance, a different style. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in, we're going to invoke jQuery here. Feel free to type along with me. And we're going to say, okay, let's do this. We're going to type as selector, so we're selecting all of the inputs of type checkbox. So we've got all those now in our object, and what we want to do is we want to say when it's clicked, so we're going to say on click. Oops. I want you, and by you I mean the program, to do the following. So we're going to pass in a function just like we did before. So when this checkbox input gets clicked, we're going to invoke this function that we're about to define. What we want to do is we want to add a CSS class not to the checkbox but to its parent list item. So the way we're going to do that is we have access to the checkbox that was clicked by doing this. So this, if we pass this into the jQuery function, we get the checkbox that was clicked. So we're going to do this dot parent, because we want the parent list item, but not the checkbox, but the parent list item. We're going to go add class, and the class that we want to add, if we won't take the time, but it's in the CSS here. The class that we want to add to give it that appearance is done. Okay, that's not all, but let's just try it and see if it works. I hope it works. There we go. So when we click on it, it gets its parent and gives it class done. But we have a problem because we never take the class off if we uncheck it. So that's our next task, okay? So let's go back over to the code. Rather than add class, we want to toggle class. That's going to say, okay, if done is already a class there, we're going to take it off. If it's not, we're going to add it. So let's just do that. Toggle class done. Let's try that. See if that's better. There we go. So you can click, it adds a class, or you can click again and it takes it away. Try and go as fast as you can. It's working. Okay, that's good. Alright, so that part's done. That was easy. What? 3 lines JavaScript using jQuery? Okay. Now let's make it so that when you type in something here and you click add, it creates a new list item and puts it in the list. So what we're going to do is we want something to happen when we click this add button. And this, if we look over here in the HTML source, here's our add button right here. It's got a class of add, so that's handy because we need to get it with our jQuery. So let's target and select add. And just like last time, we're going to go on, click. I want you to do this function. So let's go ahead now and go into the function. So let's think, before we dive in here, what do we want to do? Any takers? What needs to happen when that add button gets clicked?
Can you create another line item under the UL class to-do list?
So we need to create another line item under the UL that has a class of to-do list. Very good. And before we can create the line item, what information do we need for it? Anybody? Yeah.
We need the text that's being put into the box.
So we need the text. Exactly. So we need the text that's being put into the input box. So let's do that first. So we're going to create a new variable here with the var keyword. Var call it to do. Oops. Equals, and we are going to get that text out of that input box. And the input has a class of new to do as we look up here in the HTML. So let's get that new to do. And the way we get text is with a method, a jQuery method called val. There you go. So now we've got our text stored in a variable called to do. And now we're ready to create our new list item and put that text in. So jQuery also makes it really easy to create new elements and put them on the page. And all you have to do for that is pass in an HTML string to the jQuery function. So let's do that. In fact, what we could do, there's better ways to do this, but in the interest of time, we're just going to do it this way. Let's copy this. And let's paste it in here. Okay. So that will create a new element. Before we move on, let's fix it so that it says the text that we want rather than that previous text there. So we're just going to use string concatenation here to do. And so we've got our new element, it's got the text in it, and we want to add it now to the unordered list, the to-do list. So all we have to do is append to, and then we give it another CSS selector, to-do list. There we go. So we're creating our new element and we're appending it to the element that has a class of to-do list. I hope that works. Should we try it? Type test, we hit add. There we go. There's our new list item. But there's something we could do probably to make this a little bit better. I think it would be a good idea that once we do create that, we just get rid of that text, right? So that they can create another one without having to backspace this out. So let's jump over and do that. So we will actually use the same method that we already used. So let's first get our new to do, which is the input. And we're going to say .val, and if you call it without a parameter, it returns the value. If you call it with a parameter, it sets the value. That's kind of nice, right? So new to do.val, empty string, we've set the value now. Let's just make sure that works. Test, add, there we go, it clears it out. We can just add another one real quick. Any questions right now before we move on? Okay. We have a problem though. So we already did the part where if we click this, it toggles the class, right? And it works great because we've got these two sort of default tasks in there. But if you'll notice, as we're clicking on the third one, it doesn't work for our newly created one. Any ideas as to why that might be? Nobody? So, let me give you a hint. Well, and by give you a hint, let me tell you the answer. The reason is, see this code over here? We ran this code when the page loaded, and it did its job. It went and found all the checkboxes and assigned that event listener, and so it listens for those events, but it only ran once, and it was done. And so when we add a new checkbox, this is already run, so that checkbox doesn't know that it needs to be listening for the click event like the other ones do. Normally this would be a major pain for JavaScript programmers, but jQuery makes it really easy. It's a really simple fix. All we have to do is instead of targeting the input, we're actually going to target anything that's higher. And by higher, I mean anything that is its parent or ancestor in the document structure. So let's just go as high as we can here and just say document. Okay? And we're going to go on, click, and for the second parameter, instead of the function, we're going to pass. I should have cut and pasted instead of deleting it. We're going to pass that original that CSS selector that we had before. Input type equals checkbox. So what this allows it to do is it allows that event assignment to be dynamic. So any new events that appear inside the document that match that selector will get that event assignment, just like the first ones did, which solves the problem. Okay? So let's just make sure that that works. I think it should. Sure enough. Works great for the default ones, and if we add new ones, it works for those ones as well. Pretty slick. Okay, 8 lines of JavaScript, and we're almost done with our app. So let's move on now to the final functionality, which is that when we click the Purge Completed button, it takes out all the completed ones. So what we're going to do, as you might guess, we're going to target that button because we want to listen for its click. And that button is right here in the HTML. Look at that, it has a class already. So purge on click perform this function when that happens. Okay, who wants to tell me how we might go about doing this? We want to remove all of the ones that are done. Any ideas? Yeah.
Throw all the checkboxes and see if they're checked, and if they are, erase them.
Okay, that's an idea. So I'm just going to write that down. We could loop through checkboxes. If checked, erase. Any other ideas? Yeah.
Try doing the selector on done
Okay.
class and say remove or something like that.
Okay, so what he said is we can select the done class and remove those ones. I think that solution is maybe a little bit more concise because we don't actually have to do the loop if we already know that the ones that get clicked on have a done class on them already. So let's just select on that class. The loop would work perfectly fine, obviously. But this is a little bit faster, so let's do it that way. So, done. Remove. Pretty tough, right? So let's get rid of these comments here. Let's give it a try. Let's create a couple new ones. With creative names. And we'll hit purge, and they're gone. There you have it. So, what is that? 11 lines of JavaScript, and we have a working to-do application. Any questions? Yeah.
How would you change it if you wanted to press enter instead of clicking the button? Is that an option that would be easy fix, easy change?
Totally easy, yeah. Let's go ahead and add that. So here's our click. We'll just leave that because some users might want to do that. So let's just add that additional functionality here below. So what we're going to do is we're going to target this input with our jQuery. New to do. And we're going to listen for an event, but instead of the click event, we're going to listen for the key down event. Okay. This function that gets called, we haven't been putting it in because we haven't needed it, but it actually is given a parameter, which is an important point I think to make, is that you can call JavaScript functions and you can give them a million parameters, you can give them no parameters, and JavaScript won't care. Your application might if it's expecting those parameters, but it's just fine to call a function without giving it the parameters that it needs. Totally flexible that way. So we've been ignoring it up to this point, but it is actually given a parameter. So let's take advantage of that now, called event. And the reason why we need that is because the event is going to contain information about which key we're pressing, and we need to know which key we're pressing so that we can listen for specifically when enter is pressed. Okay? So inside of our function body, I wish I could make this smaller. That would be ideal, but it's not working
Matt,
right now.
you could try getting that sidebar back and then scooting
And then doing it?
and then try it over again.
That's a good idea. Let's try that. Let's get the sidebar back. Hey, there we go. Good idea, Morgan. Perfect. That's perfect. Okay. So inside this function, we're going to get this event. It's going to happen every time we're typing a letter. But really the only thing we care about is when enter is pressed. Okay? So we're going to do if event dot keycode equals 13. I think that's what it is. Okay, perfect. Confirmation from the crowd that the event keycode when you press enter is 13. It's a different number for every letter you press. So what we're going to do is we're essentially going to do all of this stuff, right? So why don't we bump this out into its own function, because we don't want to copy and paste, right? That's not cool. We'll call it add item. We'll just take this out. Cut that. Paste it there. And then inside here, we'll just say add item. And inside here, add item. Code reuse, right? It's always good practice. Let's try it, see if it worked. Enter. There we go. Now power users can pop those to-do items in as fast as they can type. Good idea. Great feature addition to our app. Any questions about how that works? Yeah.
Where would you recommend going to learn more about jQuery and JavaScript?
Okay, so let's you guys okay if I move this now? Are we done with it? Yep, let's leave the page. To learn more about jQuery, I think the best place would be just api.jquery.com. It's their official documentation. You can find all of the methods that we use today and tons more. I would just kind of browse through that. I know Chandler, I don't know if he's still here, he was showing me Code Academy, which is a cool site that lets you practice coding stuff. I know they have jQuery and JavaScript on there. So I would start there, yeah. Oh yeah, Morgan suggests too that you check out Stack Overflow. How many of you guys have never heard of Stack Overflow before? That's okay if you haven't, and maybe you're too embarrassed to admit. That's okay. Stack Overflow is just a place where programmers ask other programmers questions, and it's really useful. Sometimes you get stuck, you log in, you say, this is what I've got, you copy and paste some of your code, and within minutes, people are like, oh yeah, you did this, and you just need to do it this way instead. And you can answer your questions that way. So what I would do is go on Stack Overflow and search for jQuery and JavaScript and see what people are talking about. That's a good question. Any other questions? We're at the end here, folks, almost. So just to conclude, this is half a personal plug, but also I think applicable to the presentation. But JavaScript, as you get used to it, it turns out it's a great language. It's a good language to write even big applications in. I just wanted to show you to close Lucidchart, which is the company that I work for. So here we've got pretty much a full user interface with a fully featured diagramming application, and it's all written in JavaScript, you guys. All these arrows, the curves are calculated in JavaScript. They're drawn on an HTML5 canvas element with JavaScript, all the shapes, and just one of the many things that Lucidchart is doing that's, I think, cutting edge is that because the rendering of, oops, that's not good, it's only a little bit. The rendering of fonts and text in browsers is somewhat inconsistent between the different browsers. So what the guys at Lucidchart have done is they take the font files, like the TTF and OTF files, and they extract the vector data from the individual characters in the font, and they render the letters, they draw them with JavaScript, which is mind-boggling to me, but that's what's going on. And that's the only way that we could ensure that it's consistent across browsers, so the font will look the same on every browser. So there's just tons of stuff you can do with JavaScript, you guys. Tons of stuff. It's a really cool place to be coding because it's growing. Web development is extremely popular. And so the personal plug in this is that you all should be using Lucidchart, unless you enjoy emailing each other versions of Visio files and managing merges yourself. And because this is like Google Docs, you can log in, real-time collaboration on your diagrams. So if you don't like real-time collaboration, keep using Visio. But obviously I'm biased, but Lucidchart's pretty cool. And you can get a free pro account for being a student. So any questions? I think that's it for me. I think we're done. Oh, one, yeah.
Is there any way we can see your presentation online? Is it on your website?
Yeah.
And what is that?
Yeah, so let's close this here. Presentations just on my website, mjswensen.com. We'll just go there and I'll show you how to find it. It's pretty straightforward. There's a button here called Presentations, and there you go. It's right there. So you can look at it again if you want. If you are interested, you could go to github.com/mjswensen, and this top one here, mjswensen.github.io, is all the source code for my whole website. So if you went into presentations, JavaScript and jQuery, and actually I'm glad you asked because this is the presentation here, and all of the notes that I've been using are in HTML comments. So you've got the source code for the presentation, then you've got my notes in here too. So you can go back and check it out. Anything else? Thanks for coming tonight. Do I just hit stop on here, Morgan?
Yeah. So guys, thank you so much for coming. That was the presentation, and hopefully you were able to derive some value out of this value-added forum. If you liked what you saw and you think that other people would be interested, please tell your friends. Please tell those that you think would really enjoy this. The next one is going to build off of JavaScript, and there'll be more details to come on that. But thank you very much for attending, and now are you free to stick around for a few questions? So
definitely.
Raise your hand if you have any questions. Matt will be able to answer those individually, and hopefully you had a good time. Thanks.